You're listening to the Jefferson Exchange. Thanks for joining us. The JX starts today with The Debrief, where JPR reporters discuss the stories they've been covering this week, including a new homeless shelter in Yreka, a pay cut for SOU's president, and the return of Chinook salmon fishing in the Coquille River. I'm Emma J. Nelson, JPR's intern for the summer.
I'm Roman Battaglia, science, environment, and politics reporter.
I'm Justin Higginbottom, public health and safety reporter.
And I'm Jane Vaughn, housing, homelessness, and education reporter.
Justin, you had some stories on homelessness in Yreka this week. What's new in Siskiyou County?
Well, two things happened this week. So Yreka got another adult homeless shelter, the 32-bed Yreka base camp, which is already 2/3 full when I checked earlier this week. It might be totally full now. And that actually brings the total number of adult shelters in the county to only 2. The other one also opened this year. And the other piece of news is that police cleared a large homeless encampment that's been the subject of debate in town for years at this point. These things are kind of related because the city, from my understanding, wanted to wait until there were more options for homeless people before they cleared this encampment. So a couple weeks ago, at least, police posted a notice saying that by noon on Wednesday, campers at this spot behind Siskiyou Behavioral Health Services building needed to be gone. So I went down there to see what was left of the encampment and to see also if police actually cleared it, because the city has said for quite a while that they would, and that's usually delayed. But they did this time. Right at noon, bulldozers went up onto the hill, police kind of fanned out, and they kicked everyone off.
And you said this was a large encampment. Can you describe it for us? What did it look like?
Yeah, so locals and also those camping there call it Homeless Hill or just the Hill. And it's been kind of a fixture in Yreka for at least a few years, like I mentioned. It's city-owned land, and actually it was a policy of authorities to sweep campers from other parts of town and direct them here. So they said, go camp on the hill. And because they did that, it grew. It's hard to put in numbers on it, but a program manager at a shelter said at its peak there were around 100 people there, which is pretty significant in Yreka. That's not a big city. When I went, I saw maybe a dozen or 24 people left, kind of scrambling around trying to collect their belongings. There was also maybe a dozen tents left. Some of those tents looked like they had been there for a while, like they had makeshift fences, kind of porches almost. There was a lot of trash, although people there said that the city had told them to kind of put their trash in piles in the middle and that the city would dispose of it, which they never did. But anyways, it was an eyesore for locals. There's trails nearby that people didn't want to use anymore. There were complaints of drug use and crime, and so a lot of locals just wanted this gone, which finally happened.
And you spoke to those living on the hill. Where are they going? Are they going to the encampment?
So most of the people I spoke with either don't know where they would go, or they were planning on just going further into the hills and forests outside city limits, which isn't a good thing for fire prevention. It also puts these people more at risk if they need medical help or Narcan or something like that. One person I spoke with is actually going to the new shelter. He already had a bed. He was just packing up the rest of his stuff when I met him. But like I said, a few people I spoke with didn't seem very interested in that, which, to be fair, that's a small sample size. It doesn't represent everyone, but it provides at least, a sense of it, some general opinions. And they didn't want to go to the shelter because they preferred to be outside if they can't have their own apartment or house or room. Shelters do have rules, curfews, and stuff like that. Although the shelter that just opened, base camp in Yreka, is low barrier. So, for example, you don't need to be sober. You don't need to show ID. You can even bring your dog if it's well behaved. But still, some people I spoke with would prefer, I guess, more freedom to be outside.
From your story, it sounds like there were some benefits of camping in a large group for those on the hill.
Yeah, there were definitely costs and benefits after speaking with people. So the benefits were, people were able to support each other in some cases. More than one person I interviewed described some on the hill as their family, although there were also literal families living up there. I met several people who had, siblings and daughters and sons also on the hill with them. Here's Amy Oliver I spoke with. She's been on the hill for 2 years, and her 15-year-old daughter also spent time up there with her.
We come together as a community here, and we do what we have to do to survive. My daughter is awesome. She loves everybody up here. There's bad people, yes, but she says there's bad people that have houses, so we have a family here.
So, like she mentioned, there's some benefits there. There's also costs, though, like, more fights and tension, having, a lot of people there together. And, after years of people living there, it was starting to kind of resemble like a shanty town. Like I mentioned, like there was porches and stuff and fencing being erected. So understandably, a lot of locals just didn't like that in their town.
And you spoke with one of those locals who's happy to see the encampment finally cleared. What did they say?
Yeah, I spoke with Ken Barnes, who owns a butcher shop downtown, and he said a lot of people in town are just fed up at this point with the homeless situation. Whatever goodwill and compassion existed 5 years ago, for example, for him at least, is pretty much gone. Here's Barnes.
We've watched drug deals go down. We've watched drug usage in the open right through that window I'm looking through right now. It's basically across the street.
So he blames that on the homeless population and authorities letting them stay at places like the Hill. He spoke about how people don't want to go to the south side of town anymore because of this encampment, and that's kind of like the rights of those camping have superseded others in Yreka. That was his point. So he said he felt bad for the situation that many of them were in, but he's just lost patience, and it would be better for him and his business and other locals if they were pushed along, which is kind of an attitude I think that exists in a lot of places right now. It doesn't look like the issue of homelessness is going to be solved anytime soon. But in the meantime, some think it would just be better if these people were moved along, if the problem was kind of shifted elsewhere.
Okay. Well, Jane, our housing and homelessness reporter, you wrote a story this week about how the president of Southern Oregon University is taking a big pay cut. Why is that?
Yeah, because the university is facing severe financial challenges right now. So the current budget for the university is about $71 million, and President Rick Bailey announced recently that that needs to be a $60 million budget, which is about a 15% reduction, obviously pretty severe. Bailey said it's one of the most severe financial situations in the school's history. And so what happened this week so far is that President Bailey voluntarily asked the school's board of trustees to cut his pay by almost 20%. So he was making $209,000 a year, and they're cutting about $53,000-ish off of that for the rest of this fiscal year. The board voted unanimously to approve that at a meeting on Wednesday. There was some concern from the board chair, Sheila Clow, because the board had done a market assessment of President Bailey's compensation last year, and she said that President Bailey is among the lowest paid university presidents in Oregon, and this request to reduce his salary would continue to further deteriorate his compensation against the market. So that was the only kind of concern or maybe pushback that was heard, but the board did it anyway and praised him for his sacrifice there.
What's causing these severe financial issues?
There's a lot of reasons. President Bailey says the school has received inadequate state funding. They got less from the state than they expected or needed this year. There have also been a lot of actions by the Trump administration recently that have cut funding. So Pell Grant distributions have been lowered. There's less money to support low-income students. Enrollment has declined a lot for the school as well. Last year, fall 24, it declined by about 1%. This fall, it's declined by about 9%. And SOU has already increased tuition for students in 2024 and earlier this year, so they really don't want to do that again as a way to make more money. And so here we are. SOU has faced a lot of budget issues over the years. At one point, they had a projected $13 million deficit, and so they had this big fiscal realignment plan in spring of 2023 that was called SOU Forward, which really sort of helped tide the school over and deal with that issue. There were cuts at that time that were equal to about 82 full-time positions. So there's already been some pretty big cuts, but that means that it's going to be a lot harder to address this time around, because a lot of those cuts were made through attrition and not filling vacancies, voluntary retirements. And President Bailey says the school doesn't have as many opportunities like that now. The people who wanted to leave or were willing to leave probably already left a couple years ago. And so now the cuts that are going to have to happen now are going to involve people who don't want to leave.
So other than cutting the president's pay, how is the university going to be addressing this?
That has yet to be determined. President Bailey hasn't set a timeline for meeting that goal of having a $60 million budget. We don't know when that quote-unquote deadline is. There is a meeting today, this morning. It's called a campus conversation for students and faculty and staff to go in person. And President Bailey is going to go through his proposed plan for these budget cuts. The Board of Trustees received this plan via email yesterday. And one thing I think is interesting is that at that meeting this week, President Bailey was saying he really wanted to keep the focus on other people at the university who are going to be impacted by these cuts, not just him and his pay cut.
I don't want to celebrate this. I'm not even going to mention it on Friday in the campus conversation. There are a lot of people who we love and care about, faculty and staff, who are going to be part of the plan that you're going to see tomorrow. And it's a provisional plan, who are sacrificing more than I'm sacrificing. And so I want to keep it in perspective.
And so we'll have to see what's presented at the meeting today. It seems like there's going to be some pretty severe cuts, potentially layoffs. And I'll note that JPR is licensed to SOU, but we do cover the university just like any other institution. And so we'll be following up on that today.
Thank you, Jane. Roman, you brought us some news yesterday about Chinook salmon restoration on the Coquille River in Southwest Oregon. What's that news?
Yeah, the big news that they announced was that the Coquille tribe and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife are seeking to reopen Chinook salmon fishing on the Coquille River this fall. That's because they've had a lot of success with this hatchery program to raise and release Chinook salmon in the river the last few years. And that's kind of because the tribe became a co-manager of this hatchery with the state. So they've been able to really increase the hatchery fish populations. The fishing of Chinook salmon has been closed since 2021 on the Coquille. So they're sending this proposal to the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission, which is going to consider it in mid-September. But it sounds like from those I talked to that it's likely that they'll approve it because, all these scientists are saying we should reopen fishing here.
And why was the Chinook salmon fishing even closed in the Coquille River to begin with?
Yeah, I think there's a couple reasons. One major, one of the smaller reasons, but also contributing is warmer water temperatures because of climate change and other environmental impacts, and that's hurt the ability for salmon to breed. They have a harder time breeding and stuff when the water temperatures are warmer. But another major reason, and I think the biggest contributor to this, has been the non-native smallmouth bass in the river. They were illegally introduced into the river in around 2010 in the Coquille. And then by around 2018, their population has really just exploded. And this is really bad for the salmon in the river because these bass will eat the juvenile salmon as they make their way down. These juveniles are like the perfect sized prey for these bass. So, the population of the Chinook salmon really began to plummet between 2018 to 2021. They used to see around 8,000 to 10,000 salmon return from the ocean every year to their spawning grounds in the river. But since 2018, those numbers have dropped to just a few hundred every year. So huge drop.
That is a major drop. What does that mean?
Yeah, I talked to someone from the Coquille tribe who said that the wild Chinook salmon are essentially what he calls functionally extirpated. That basically means that if they were just left alone, that the humans weren't there anymore, that all the wild Chinook in the Coquille would disappear and would go extinct. So that's not good.
No.
Another big problem at the time was that the hatchery was also not doing well. So the state, like I mentioned, has this fish hatchery to breed and then release Chinook salmon in the Coquille. And that's kind of designed to help fishers who want to go fishing. They can fish these hatchery salmon. But previously, they used to catch the wild salmon by hand and then use them for breeding. But then they switched to using this trap in 2014 where they would catch the hatchery fish who were returning to the hatchery instead. They need to catch around 75 pairs of salmon for a viable hatchery that year, but the trap was not working very well. In 2020, they only caught 3 breeding pairs of salmon that year. So if they lost both the wild Chinook and the hatchery Chinook, that would kind of be a disaster for these salmon on the Coquille. So that's why the tribe wanted to come in and help with the restoration.
So how has the Coquille tribe been helping with the restoration?
Yeah, so like I said, the tribe became a co-manager of the hatchery in 2022. They've gotten kind of volunteers together and helped overhaul the program. They redesigned the trap, which was a big, important thing, and now they're catching record numbers of returning salmon. I think over 100 to 200 salmon pairs coming back to the hatchery. And they're now just trying to release as many as possible as they can into the river. They've also done some genetic testing that's found that the hatchery and the wild fish are the same, so they can use these hatchery fish to repopulate upstream. They're trying to remove a lot of the smallmouth bass to help the wild salmon do a lot better in the program. So that's kind of why, they're bringing everything together. They're having a lot of success, and hopefully people can now fish in the river again while they continue to work on this.
I hope so. That's it for the debrief this week. Thanks for listening. You can reach the newsroom with comments on our coverage and suggestions for things we should cover in the future through our news tip line. That's on our website at ijpr.org. And you can find this program and more at jeffexchange.org, or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform.